this country, and I say bring it on.
Well done, the Acting Minister of Energy.
I call the honourable member Catherine Delahunty.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker. Tēnā koe te whare. The budget, Mr Speaker, seems like a long time ago now, that dreadful day where we sat here staring at each other with those blue documents. It's amazing what's happened since. It seems to have been out there in the community now, seem to have been in meetings constantly discussing it. And it's interesting hearing Louise's speech, because Sue Moroney, Louise Upson and myself have been in a lot of meetings talking about education, and people don't seem quite as happy as she might have wished. It was a very calculated budget. It was definitely very calculated, and it pushed the middle-class people of this country right to the edge of their voting tolerance, but not over the edge, because they have further privatisation of state assets on the books. They were quite careful to say that that would happen later. So it was interesting to think about the budget in terms of what we were paying for and how we are going to pay for tax cuts to the top 13% of this country, because although the previous speaker claims that the lower income people benefited hugely, I'm not sure that 25 cents an hour for people on the minimum wage can be described as a wonderful relief to their financial problems. And so the budget did not lift people out of poverty and did not assist people on low incomes. But it was very educational. I'm going to talk about education because that's our select committee that I share with those other members. This budget was very educational, but not actually as generous to the education sector as the government likes to claim. I think, as Sue Moroney pointed out, there has been a 2.9% increase in operational funding to schools, and we have to be clear that you can spin numbers any way you like, but you cannot say that that will cover the cost of inflation or the absolute role in growth in roles. And it will strongly affect schools which are struggling with increased running costs, and I'm not sure which ones aren't. So an increase that fails the basic test of meeting inflation is actually a cut. And that is not the only area of deep concern to the Green Party. Looking beneath all the rhetoric about protecting education from the cuts to public services, we need to unpack that impact, in what ways this was a zero budget for schools. And a classic example of this is the analysis of what schools have to pay for out of the operation grants. So if that 2.9 doesn't cover the inflation and the schools have to pay for a lot of the services that they use from operation grants, something's going to give. And an example is school support staff. They have to be paid out of that operational grant. And so there goes the workers who are school support staff hopes of a decent wage increase or hours needed to do their jobs. And it's not just those people saying they want more money to look after our vulnerable and marginalised children and ensure that there is inclusion. It's the fact that they actually need the hours to do it as well. And I'd like to give an example of what that means to families whose child who has a disability and is currently participating in school with the support of a person whose hours are paid for out of that operational budget. That child loses that person, that child loses their human rights to participate, and that actually should be of concern to all of us. The budget continues to fund the implementation of national standards. But, as we heard at the many meetings we've been to on education already, what a waste of resources that is. $37 million is being spent to force something onto schools who in large measure cannot refuse to try and do it, but would rather spend the money on rolling out the modern curriculum than measuring students according to the narrow and confused standards of success and failure that are not going to result in a national overview of any real value, and nor are they going to set any standards worth having. Unless, of course, you believe that league tables are going to create better results, and it actually helps young children become confident learners if they are labelled. Labelling them as losers at an early age has predictable results, which is why countries as diverse as Korea and Finland have abandoned these assessment models and have broadened rather than narrowed their curriculums. However, this waste of money on national standards is not the only problem we have with the budget's educational allocation. The Green Party is very concerned about the commitment to the privatisation of state assets, which leads us straight to the pilot project for public-private partnerships in school buildings. This budget allocates $800,000 in the next year to develop a detailed business case for public-private partnerships in the procurement of new school property. They have to do that because they got exposed by Radio New Zealand as not having one that worked. So they're going to do that, and they're going to increase the money to $6.7 million by 2015. Well, I could save the government money right now and tell them there is no business case for public-private partnerships in public schools. The existing business case obtained by Radio New Zealand earlier this year already showed that developing the contractual models and conditions to allow these PPPs to go ahead would cost as much as any supposed benefits achieved from them. The overseas evidence is clear that however you set up a PPP, the public ends up funding the project while the private partner creams the profit off the top. That's why they're there. That's why they want to be there. Meanwhile, boards of trustees will have their ability to make strategic decisions about the future of their schools constrained by the private quote-unquote partner. And what happens after 25 years when the private partner returns a rundown asset to the state? The potential costs to the public are huge. That's the history, that's the evidence, so why are we wasting budget money trying to make a business case for a failed model? The Green Party has been the only party to consistently oppose PPPs in the education sector, and we continue to do so in the face of this allocation in the budget. The public sector cuts and job losses across many departments will also impact on education. Already it has been signalled that the Education Review Office and the NZQA will be merged. And this may have little meaning in terms of both performing functions related to the education system and therefore could share an office. However, that may not be the agenda. There may well be problems if the real issue is cutting costs and losing staff in both organisations. And that's what public service cuts are about. It's not actually about rationalising for the sake of meaning, it's about rationalising for the sake of money. And efficiency can be the label for a multitude of sins. The budget also failed to reverse last year's cuts to early childhood education. 400 million was stripped from the sector last year. This year, the government has so generously put back 550. But this does not reverse the cuts to centres with more than 80% qualified staff, who will continue to face the unpalatable choice of either firing their qualified staff or charging more to parents to make up the shortfall. And Louise Upson, myself and Sue Moroney were at the kindergarten conference where people raised this issue with us, and they were deeply concerned. They were not supportive of this direction, and they do not want the government to pursue this path. We already know that thousands of children around the country are missing out on high quality, and I'll emphasise high quality because that's what qualification actually means. Qualification and quality, they're connected words. High quality early childhood education because of these cuts. In the current environment, the 150 million that's been put back barely meets the expected role growth and demand. This is not an investment in the early years, which all the evidence suggests is so important, and it's barely enough to keep them afloat. The one ray of light is that they did provide money to target groups who are currently at a disadvantage in accessing ECE. And everyone supports early childhood being available to all, and particularly to communities in most need. However, we continue to have major concerns about who is missing out when aspects of universality are undermined in the name of targeting. So on the one hand, it looks good to say we know who's missing out, we'll put the scarce resource with them, but if you lose universality, you are going to miss out on all the people with mild to moderate needs. And this has always been true in education, and that's why universal provision of things like welfare and education are so important, because sometimes the rest of it does not work. Everyone from the Children's Commissioner to the Chief Science Advisor has called for more spending on early childhood education, not less, and for quality and universal availability. So why have a Chief Science Advisor if you're going to ignore that advice? And as my colleague Gareth Hughes, who has 2 young children, recently said, I could not send my child to a dentist who wasn't qualified, so why would I want that in his early childhood teacher? And I think that's a fairly irrefutable argument, that we don't send the kids off to get the dental nurse who's almost qualified or maybe not qualified, but it's an awfully nice person and loves children to fix their teeth. So how come it's okay when it comes to their education? It is a curious fact that the budget fails to prioritise children when we all know they require a greater investment in resources than motorways, sporting cups and irrigation systems. The government has a choice, and they now have the evidence that children must be put first in our economy, not last. And that means their education from early childhood right through to high school. We have huge issues in education to address, from bullying, which needs a major investment in restorative justice in schools. There's some good work going on, but we're not leading it from Parliament. It's being led by the community sector and by many of the academics, and it's being piloted in very good schools. But this budget is not helping those issues. Kia ora tātou.
I call